All right, I guess we might as well proceed then. What I sent out to you is part of what I'm going to talk about. I really am not sure where we're going, but then that's nothing new. I never do know beforehand. But we'll wander around some of the more central themes than we have before. Some of the other topics I've taken kind of start from scratch. Well, this time we're going to swim a little bit more deeply than we have in the past. I'm going to start out by raising a question, or at least addressing a question that sometimes has been raised about the difference between natural science and philosophy. Because the question is often raised as to why can't philosophers provide experimental proofs of what they're saying, just like the natural scientists do. And this is based upon a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of natural science versus philosophy. This is not a simple thing to consider, but you have to realize that natural science is dealing with a phenomena, which is a word they picked up from Immanuel Kant, and which they somewhat transformed, because according to Kant, when you know phenomena, all you are knowing is your subjective experience. You don't know the real world. But when a modern natural scientist uses the term phenomena, he's talking about clearly something he believes to be existing and happening in the external environment, in the real world, perhaps in stars that are millions of light years away from here. This raises some interesting epistemological questions, but we went into those in previous nights, so I'm not going to go back to them right now. But the term phenomena still means that we're only dealing with the appearances of things. And as such, it has an impact on the function of natural science, because what natural science is doing actually is trying to understand the relations that exist between phenomena in such a way as to be able to formulate these in terms, say, of formulae, which are predictive of future events. And therefore, in order to verify these hypotheses, which they have come up with to explain the relationship between observed phenomena, the verification consists in performing experiments which will support the hypotheses which have been proposed. This, of course, can get extremely complicated. It isn't always a matter of simply observing that chickens have wings. It's a matter oftentimes of trying to express rules of the universe in terms of Newtonian or Einsteinian physics, which entail extremely complex expressions, but always what they're doing is trying to find some consistent way to understand and interpret the phenomena of the world. But the difficulty is, because they're only dealing with phenomena, they're not dealing with the reality itself. They are dealing with the reality as we observe it. And they, of course, do so with great specification. That is to say, they are trying to understand exactly, for example, the properties of an electron or some kind of subatomic particle of a minor sort. They don't even know. See, it's a philosophical question if you ask, do electrons exist? But if you ask, is an electron 1/1840th the atomic mass of a proton? Is that right? You can answer that question because you're giving a relationship between the phenomena of the electron as we read its mass in relationship to the mass of a proton. Now you can attempt to verify that by some kind of experimental process. So what you're doing is you're going from an hypothesis based upon observed phenomena that are usually in great detail, and from it you're trying to predict and verify this hypothesis by some kind of experimental project. knowing always that you only need to find one experimental result which contradicts your hypothesis in order to realize that your hypothesis was wrong. And this does allow us, though, to attain rather high degrees of certitude, very high degrees of certitude in some cases. But of course, as we've seen, for example, with Newtonian physics, which was taken as the established law, this got overturned by Einstein and Planck and others in the modern period, so that what was taken as established law suddenly turned out not to be quite established. And this problem, of course, arises even for the replacement theories. Now, how does that differ from philosophy? Because after all, we're trying to do philosophy here, aren't we? The philosopher is dealing not with the phenomena, but rather with the substances of things themselves, known by means of properties which are undeniably present. Now you might ask, how can we know that a property is undeniably present? Well, we know it because we don't try to attain knowledge of the specific essence of something. The scientist is trying to attain knowledge of a very specific essence. He wants to know what is the nature exactly of an electron, or a proton, or of gravity. That isn't the work of the philosopher. The philosopher is addressing questions that are so broad that the details which the natural scientist gets into, and which gets him into problems of establishing certitude, these do not arise for the philosopher because he deals with more general questions. For example, we know that the essence of a horse is that it is sentient. But of course, we also know that there's an awful lot of other things that are sentient, that they have senses. That doesn't tell us a huge amount about the horse itself. The natural scientist would want to know everything possible about the horse itself. But the philosopher is, for his purposes, satisfied with simply realizing this is a sentient being, a sentient organism. And we do that because the properties manifest by the essence of this horse are so evident that they not only apply to this horse, but they apply to an awful lot of other things. We may not be able to divide between those various objects the way that the natural scientist does. What I'm trying to get to here is that this is a different project, very different. We know, for example, that a cactus is alive, but we may not know the difference or be able to establish philosophically the difference between a cactus and a rutabaga or a giant sequoia. If you want to know the answer to that, ask the natural scientist. But you see, when you ask the natural scientist, he is giving you so many details that he's immersed in the phenomena to the extent that he trades in certitude in the process of getting greater specificity. And that is why he has to go back to experience to run an experiment to verify his complex hypothesis. I told you we're going to do something a little different today. Sulfur. We know that, as a philosopher, we know it's some stuff that can interact with other, what we call chemicals. If you're a chemist, you want to know its properties, its atomic mass, its valence. You want to know specifically how it interacts according to the laws of inorganic chemistry with other objects. The philosopher doesn't care about that. He just knows it interacts. That is sufficient. We know that man, for reasons that we've explored in philosophical psychology, is both a material and a spiritual being. These are very broad concepts, though. It's enough to distinguish man from a carrot, but it doesn't tell us a huge amount about the biochemistry of individual men. We know that natural things are movable. That's such a basic property that it applies to any natural physical object. But it doesn't tell us the details of acceleration, momentum, gravitational impact upon physical objects, and so forth. That belongs to the natural scientist. We know, for example, that events must be caused. We know that if a thing does not explain its own being, something else has to explain it. Those are philosophical questions. We know that all phenomena, which the scientist is dealing with, are ultimately grounded in substances. But please notice that this, again, is a very general kind of knowledge. We know that everything is what it is, but that doesn't tell us anything about what it is. In other words, we're dealing with broad, unmistakable, essential notes in philosophy. Notes that are so broad that we know, for example, that if something moves, we may not know very much about what it's made out of or how fast it's accelerating or the details of its biochemistry, but we are able to speak about it in terms of something changing, some new qualities of existence, introducing notions of potency and act and so forth. I'm not trying to get into all these details right now, but just in a broad way, what I'm trying to show is that the natural scientist is dealing with reality in a very different way from the philosopher. You often hear about differences, but this is a difference that strikes at the way they handle the data itself. The natural scientist is therefore capable of giving great specificity down to submicroscopic details about the objects that he's dealing with and come up with grand hypotheses to explain the predictable behavior of these objects. But the price that he pays is that he has limited certitude about the objects he's describing, and his whole theory could be wrong. It's always possible. If he finds one contradictory experimental result, the whole thing has to be trashed. Now, of course, those scientific materialists would tend to say, well, but you can't prove anything because you can't give an experimental demonstration of your claims. What the natural scientist, or let's say the scientific materialist, is doing is he's trying to bring you back to his level of reality so that you can verify what you're claiming, because that's his way of getting back to existence. But he hasn't gotten to existence anyway, because he started with phenomena, created a grand hypothesis about it, and predicts what kind of phenomena should result under certain observable conditions in the future. If they occur, he can legitimately say, well, this result tends to support my hypothesis. He can never say it absolutely proves it. He can, if he finds a contradictory result, say, well, my hypothesis was dead wrong. But that's the level at which he operates. Because he's operating with phenomena, he has to go back to the phenomena to verify the reality of his hypothesis. But he's still caught in the web of phenomena. The difference with philosophy is we are starting with direct experience of reality, and we never really leave it. What we're doing, we look, for example, at motion. And examining motion, we can see that certain intelligible, self-evident first principles require that something that's in motion cannot move itself, something else has to move it. We can chase back the logic of that motion all the way to the Aristotelian or Thomistic first mover. But that's because the very reality of the motion requires this logical apparatus. Once you establish the existence of that first mover, you can then say, well, certain properties have to belong to that first mover, and from those you can make deductions. But not by way of experimental verification, Rather, you are still grounded in that initial experience of something in motion and what that has to mean. Don't forget that the natural scientist is using the same principles as I mentioned to you previously. He uses principles of identity, non-contradiction, sufficient reason, causality, in order to explain the phenomena that he's observing. We do the same thing in philosophy, but we are not doing what he's doing. I'm not going to cast aspersions on it because what he's doing is very different than what we're trying to do. In its own order, it is amazing because it has created the technological world in which we exist today, and which allows us to have air conditioning. But it's not a world which gives you the kind of certitude about the more general truths of the world which the philosopher seeks to investigate. Philosophers are not those who claim to know everything about everything. If you know even a little bit with certitude in this world, you're way ahead of most people who think they can't know anything for sure, except, of course, that they don't know anything for sure. Now, what are we dealing with here? We're talking about knowing the nature of things, and that's kind of coming back to the topic I suggested to you in the material that was sent to you through the email. We're talking about knowing a world which, whether you're a philosopher or a scientist, you're trying to understand the natures of things. No scientist could do science for a second if he wasn't trying to understand nature. And he tries to understand nature by observing what it does. And if he were to cease doing this, he would be out of work instantly. What is the starting point for our knowledge of nature? We talked in previous classes about Descartes, who has the starting point of cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, in which he's bound up within the knowing self. Jacques Maritain suggests a different starting point, although it's the same starting point, but he elucidates it differently. He says, "Scio aliquid esse." That means, I know something to be. That is what Descartes missed. He got the ego part of it. He recognized the self in the act of knowing, but he neglected to notice that every time we know something. And in knowing something, we are knowing what we call an essence. We're knowing something about what a thing is. Whenever I say, there's something there, or that is a snake, we are affirming two things. We're affirming there's some reality there, but we are also to some extent specifying it. We're also to some extent describing what is there. So right at the very basic structure of our knowledge, we begin by knowing two aspects of reality. One, that there's something there. Two, that there is something there in the sense of some kind of a nature, essence, quiddity, form, structure, whatever you want to call it. And that, of course, is what we get a hold of with our mind, with our intellect, when we try to understand the whatness of what it is we've encountered. We can't, the mind, whenever we encounter something, we can't help but express ourselves in terms of those two factors. There's something there, and at the same time, we render an awareness of something about it, whatever it may be. What is our first awareness in our human life? Well, probably in your mother's womb, it's an awareness of warmth and softness. You didn't have words for them, because of course first we know things, then we invent words to describe them. But you knew there's something there, and you were aware somehow of what kind of a thing it was that you were encountering. You can't separate those two elements. They're always present. You can separate them in this sense. You can conceive of what something is, but not know that it's real. But when you encounter something real, you cannot prescind from its reality. The reality is given, but that reality is also given under some kind of a form, some kind of a structure, some kind of a whatness. Yes, it's sensed. Of course it's sensed. But being human beings, we immediately engage in something that our animal friends don't, and that is we understand it. We use the word understand. You know, what better word can we give? We penetrate the nature of it. And see, that's what's at issue between those that are dealing merely with the phenomena and those that are dealing with the essence of things. The problem with the phenomena is it's just the appearance. And you're always wondering a little bit. See, the ambiguity the scientist has is, sure, he's got a phenomena with a certain appearance, but he's not quite sure that this particular detail, maybe a certain color or a certain shape, whether it applies only to this object or whether it applies to many others. In other words, the more detail he has, the more he's puzzled as to how many things it applies to and where it doesn't apply, and how do you define the difference. Whereas philosophically, if you're just looking at something as basic as motion, we don't care. We don't care if it's a cactus or a racehorse or a rocket that's in motion. Doesn't matter, because we're dealing with motion. And that's all. And then we can discuss what's entailed in motion. How do we know the nature of things? We know nature through activity. It doesn't matter if you're a philosopher or a natural scientist, that's how you do it. Can you imagine a chemist trying to describe the chemical properties of, say, lithium? You could say, well, you just describe what it looks like. No, you don't describe what it looks like. The first thing that you learn, if you take a basic chemistry course, is that you get one heck of a reaction if you drop it in a pail of water. And if you drop an elephant in a pail of water, you don't get that reaction. See? So you know something about that lithium because you know what it does under certain circumstances. Nature is revealed by activity. What's that based on? It's based on the old principle, nihil dat quod non habet. Nothing can give what it doesn't have. You don't get being from non-being. So you don't get something that reacts violently with water from something that doesn't have it in it, the ability to do it. And when you say it has it in it, the ability to do it, you're talking about nature. Nature, Aristotle defines as the first principle of being and motion in that in which it is. Dr. de Koning took about 2 months explaining that to us. I don't have 2 months. First principle of being and motion. In other words, it's whatever it is down in the very bowels of this reality. First principle of being and motion, that is activity. It's whatever it is down in the bowels of this reality that make it behave this way. Now, we don't directly perceive the essence of anything because we know through sensation. But we know through sensation by observing certain, what we call per se properties, per se accidents or properties. In other words, properties, qualities that are inherent in the very nature of the thing and which you cannot separate from the thing. So that if something is moving, it's because it's movable in its nature. Other types of accidents may or may not be present. You might have something like an automobile could be white or blue or green. They all move, we hope. The color doesn't matter. The color is not a property of being an automobile, but it's a property of being a natural object, a physical object that it's subject to change, subject to motion, subject in Einsteinian terms to the vicissitudes of the space-time continuum. So what we want to focus on now, let me just underline once again. The natural scientist can't do his work without knowing natures. And he knows natures by observing activity. As looking at it philosophically, we're going to do the same thing, but in a much broader way. We are going to notice that things do have natures, and another word for nature is essence. That brings us over to what I gave you on this sheet of paper. When we talk about essence, we're talking about all of the structural limitations that something has. I don't want to get into too much of the Aristotelian distinctions, but it's what is called individual essence as opposed to specific essence. Specific essence is what we all have in common as human beings. But specific essence is a concept in the mind based upon a reality in the individuals. So every individual expresses his humanity in a different way. It is a common humanity. As it is common, though, it exists in the mind as a universal concept. But concretely, in the individual human being, it is going to be under specific qualifications, qualities, accidents that are peculiar to this individual person at this unique point in time. So if we're asking, how do you exist? Your concrete existence is limited by all, not only your specific essence, but all of the individual qualifications that describe and demark and delimit the actuality of your being at this moment in time. And when we're talking about essence here, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that in the world of our experience, beings are limited. They have existence, but that existence is always concretely realized in an individual way. This is so manifest that we don't even think about how it could be otherwise, and that, of course, is why people debate, do you believe in an infinite being? Because they don't even, at first blush, everything we encounter is finite. Everything is limited. Everything is concrete, individuated, individual. So it sounds like a pure abstraction to talk about an infinite being. But this flows from the fact that whenever we know reality, we know it under these two aspects. That it's something existing, but it exists differently from being to being to being. And the differently is marked by the essence, what we call essence, the whatness, quidditas. The quidditas is the nature expressed in terms of how we know what the thing is. So the way that the mind approaches reality inevitably breaks into the difference between existence and essence, in that we know there's something there, but we instantly affirm the whatness of it. I bumped into something and it was a chicken. I bumped into something and it was a Sherman tank. I bumped into something and I don't know what it is, but I know it has certain properties. I don't have to know what it is. I know, though, that there's a difference between that there's something there, that there's a fundamental actuality there, there's a reality there, and the whatness of it. Because the whatness keeps changing from experience to experience to experience, from being to being to being. The whatness is always different. And even though we're all human beings, our whatness is different at the individual level. So we've got, on the one hand, existence, which is transcendental. Anything that's real's got it. But on the other hand, existence comes in various whatnesses. Moreover, we can conceive of a whatness, as is mentioned here, We can conceive of a oneness, but not know whether it exists. I can conceive of dinosaurs, but as far as I know, there aren't any. So, knowing what a thing is doesn't tell me that it is, which means there's an irreducible distinction in my mind between essence and existence. Yes?
I can say I'm a chef, and I've conceived of turnip-flavored ice cream, which no one ever thought before. So even though it has never been made, I conceive that it's possible, and it would taste, have a certain flavor and texture.
Right.
So that it has an essence. The world, there are millions of possible things that no one ever thought of that could be. Would you say they have an essence?
You don't have a really existing essence till you got a really existing object.
Okay.
And that's why the essence of humanity is real, because it's grounded. It's not just in my mind, it's grounded in the individual real human beings that share that essence.
So something I conceive but doesn't exist.
All you've got there is just a concept. It might not even be possible.
Right.
And I hope it isn't in the case of the ice cream you described. Turnip-flavored ice cream, did you say? But you see, this does mean that in the way our mind works, we are aware radically of the difference between existence and essence. And one argument that has been put forward is this: the mind is the only way we know being. It's made to know being. And if it's made to know being, and if it cannot reduce essence to existence in the way that the mind itself functions, that has to be because reality is built that way. In other words, that's actually an argument that existence is different from essence in things. Otherwise, we would not be forced to think this way in an irreducible manner. I'm not going to ask you to accept that argument, but I just want you to notice that that is one argument that's been put forward. What I'm trying to get to tonight, I finally am getting down to the sheet that I handed out to you. Now that we have some idea of what we mean by essence, and it's something about the nature of existence. Essence is the reason why a thing is what it is. In other words, it's whatever there is in a being that specifies what it is, what it's got, what it's doing, what it's able to be. This is not some abstract notion. This is the very reality of every being, of everything. It is expressing itself with certain determinate qualities and characteristics. If it's a rhinoceros charging at you at 40 miles an hour, that's a very great reality. This is not just a pure concept we're talking about. We're talking about a real something that has real characteristics that can run you down. It exists, but then so does a tulip. And a tulip really exists, but its qualities and characteristics are very different. So what we find in the universe is that everything that is real has existence. Now, existence matters. Existence isn't just a word. Existence is the fundamental actuality of a thing. That's what it says here, in fact. Of any being insofar as it's a being. Those are just words. But existence is what makes the difference between the concept of a bullet and the bullet that strikes your heart and kills you. Existence makes all the difference in the world. Would you like $100,000? Sure, but I'm just thinking about it. You want the reality. So both reality counts and essence counts. They're both real factors in anything that you could possibly encounter. The question before us tonight is, could they be the same? Could essence and existence be the same thing, just looked at differently? That is a question that has confronted philosophers for a long time. It was Boethius who first raised the distinction between what a thing is and that it is. But it wasn't until you get to Thomas Aquinas that you have clearly taught that existence is really other than existence. I'm sorry, than essence. Existence is really other than essence. He gives an example in which he compares it to two things that are clearly different. So there's no doubt that's really what he's teaching. How do we know? Well, he gives a few arguments. What I'm citing from here is a small work, the De Ente ad Essentia, on being an essence, which was written when he was about 30 years old. It's perhaps the earliest of his works. It was supposed to be just a little metaphysical primer for some of his confreres, and we're still trying to understand it. But in it, one of the things he says, if to be were to be horse, then everything that would be a horse. In other words, if existence were identical to horseness, then everything that would exist would have to be a horse. Now, this still is a little hard to get a hold of, and that's why we go a little bit further here. Before we do that, I want to just pick up this thing about what do we mean by, what kind of a distinction is there supposed to be between essence and existence? These are what are called minor real distinctions. It's a minor real distinction between two metaphysical principles. And this is what bedevils the materialist who doesn't know what you're talking about here, or what we're talking about here, because they say, wait a minute, if you got two things, you're going to be able to separate them. Well, that's what we call a major real distinction. A minor real distinction means you've got not two things, but two principles within a single thing. One is not the other, but you can't separate them. And I ask, what's a good example of that? The answer is there aren't any. The only examples are ones that you discover in metaphysics. Surprise, surprise. The distinction between things like form and matter, essence and existence, act and potency, accidents and substance. But those are already within the metaphysical realm, aren't they? So I'm not going to assume what I'm trying to prove here, but at least I want you to understand the very concept of the distinction between essence and existence in any concretely existing thing is such that you can't pull out the essence and still have the existence sitting there. And you can't pull out the existence and still have a really existing essence. We don't have drawers in the philosophy department offices. You pull them out, there's a few essences there. They're not to be found. The only really existing essences are existing in real beings which already have existence. You can't separate them. It would be like trying to remove the color from you. You've always got a color. That's an accidental being. If we remove the color, you disappear. You wouldn't be there at all. We can't make you colorless. Just like we can't take away your weight. Some of us wish we could a little. But weight is part of being a physical thing. You take away the weight, the being's gone. Hard to imagine how that is possible. The closest example I can think of is, imagine that you have, imagine that you have in that corner of the room, let's say, you've got over there a projector of pure red light. We'll put a white screen up here. And here we've got a projector of pure blue light. And what color are you going to get on the screen if you turn them both on? You'll get purple, okay? We'll say that. Now, imagine that we took this room and completely blacked it out. So there's absolutely no light in the room, whatever, except these two projectors we're going to turn on. We'll even take all the atmosphere out so you can't even see any little dust boats floating in the air. So you don't even see the beams of light coming. All you see is what's on the screen, which will be purple. Now, in the purple, can you separate the red from the blue? You can't. But is the red really there? Yes. Is the blue really there? Yes. One difference, though, if you turn off one of the projectors, you still have the other light. But if you turn off existence or essence, you got nothing left. Or any of these other metaphysical principles. Anyway, that's the concept of the kind of distinction they have. Now, let's go further and see whether we can demonstrate in 10 minutes how this can be proven. That is to say, how can we prove that existence is really distinct from essence, not just conceptually distinct? If you look, she's my angel here. If you look at the, right, it's John's angel. If you look at the section from On Being and Essence that I have before you, there is an argument given which says, first of all, no essence is intelligible without its parts. Imagine a triangle. Could you understand a triangle if you took away one of its sides? Or if you took away one of its angles? That's what this means. Now, every essence or quiddity can be understood without knowing anything of its existence. For I can know what a man or a phoenix is. Now look at those examples. A man, they're all around us. A phoenix is a mythical bird that rises up out of its own ashes. It's not only non-real, it's impossible. So what St. Thomas was trying to do there, of course, was to tell you, it doesn't matter what kind of essence you're talking about. A real essence, a really existent essence, or one that isn't even possible. The point is I can know what it is and still remain ignorant of whether it exists in reality. Doesn't tell me anything about whether it actually exists. I can know fully the essence of a dodo bird. I don't know if there are any. As far as I know, I guess there aren't. Thus it is clear that existence is other than essence or quiddity. Watch that other than. Some scholars have argued that the other end didn't mean really different, it only meant conceptually different. Father Joseph Owens at the University of Toronto used to maintain that at the Pontifical Institute. But watch the rest of it. He says, unless perhaps there is a being whose quiddity is its very essence, but there can only be one such being. Now, this is what's known as the famous man and phoenix argument. The man and phoenix argument says you can know what a thing, but you don't know whether it exists in reality. Therefore, essence is different than existence. And I'll tell you up front, that's been the subject of a lot of controversy. And for my own part, I'd rather not get into the controversy, especially here tonight. I'm going to suggest that we look a little further into the text and look at something else that it says here. Notice he says, unless perhaps there is a being whose quiddity or essence is its very existence. Remember, nature is what determines all the qualities a thing has. Even looking at it as a natural scientist, we know the nature of a thing by what it can do, what it does, how it manifests itself. So nature governs existence. It determines how existence is manifested. If you had a being whose nature was existence, the problem is, could you take any existence away from it and still have it be that? That's why he says there can only be one such being. The first being, for nothing can be multiplied except, and he goes on to give us a number of ways to multiply things that don't matter here. This is what we have to think of. Imagine that you've got two beings. Being number one, being number two. Now, could you have two beings whose nature is identical to existence? Is that possible? In other words, if we're going to say nature and existence are not distinct, what does that mean? It means the nature of the thing is existence itself. Now remember, existence is not just a word. It's the actuality of everything that is in any way, shape, or manner possible to be or actually be, is. So if you say something's nature is existence, what you're saying is it's got to have every quality that existence could possibly manifest. Now, if you have two such beings, what makes them different? Why are they two instead of one? If they're two, one of them's got to have something the other one doesn't have, right? Or it's got to lack something the other one's got. So one of these is not pure existence. One of these is not a being whose nature is identical to existence. So one of these is a being that's lacking some existence. It's lacking some existence. If it's lacking existence, guess what? That's what we call a finite being. It's a limited being. But in being limited, that means that its essence isn't absolutely identical to its existence. It has existence, but it is not itself existence. Now, logically, if you've got two beings, it's possible both of them are finite. If you have two beings, though, could you have one that is pure existence? It's possible, isn't it, logically? You might have one whose nature is existence. You might say, how am I getting that? The point is you got two beings, not one. If you got two, there's a difference between them, a real difference. That means one's got a quality of existence the other one doesn't have. So they can't both be beings in which you have the essence identical to existence. One could be, but they can't both be. So one of these is a being that has existence, receives existence, participates existence, but it's not identical to existence. And because it's lacking some quality of existence, that's what we mean by being finite. It's limited. It's limited. It's not every possible aspect of existence. Now, all the things we encounter in the world are limited. We're used to encountering finite beings, but this we're looking at in the most hypothetical, theoretical manner. If you have two beings, one's got to be limited, it's got to be finite, and it's got to be composed of essence and existence. That's a little Latin word for to be. It's got to be composed. The other one might be pure existence. We don't know. What if you had three of these beings? What could you say about that? Got to have a difference between them, right? In that case, you could have one whose nature is existence, but the other two can't, because there's got to be a difference between them. In other words, only one could possibly have every aspect of existence. The others are going to be differentiated because they're lacking something. What I'm trying to show here is that if, no matter how many beings you have, there are only two possibilities. Either all of them are differentiated from the others because they're limited, they don't have unlimited existence. They're like like a triangle missing a side. It's missing part of existence. If it's missing part of existence, its nature is not existence. That is, it's not identical to existence because it's lacking part of existence. Just like a triangle lacking a side. Its nature is not pure triangularity because it's lacking a side. A being lacking some existence is not pure existence. That means its nature is not identical to existence because it's lacking some existence. It's lacking some actualities. Don't think of existence like it's a little piece of cream pie or something. It might be that it's lacking intelligence. It's lacking, it might be a lead balloon. It's just not an infinite balloon. There's reality's missing from it in some way or other. If you have three beings like this, you would have to have two like this. One might be pure existence. You don't know. You don't know. There are only two possibilities here. Every being is a limited being, in which case it's composed of essence and existence. Its nature is not identical to existence. Or every being except one is this way. This does not demonstrate the existence of a being whose nature is existence. Because the other alternative is maybe they're all just finite beings. But if they're finite, they're composed of essence and existence. And if they're composed of essence and existence, then existence and essence are really distinct in them. That's the point of this. I'm not trying here to demonstrate that there is an infinite being whose nature is existence. That's another question. But that's not what I'm concerned with tonight. You can see that maybe you can quickly get there if you read the rest of what the article says, but that's not our concern. I'm just trying to show that in a universe of limited beings, because they're limited, their nature cannot be identical to existence. Every limited being expresses part of the actuality of what is possible with existence. Existence isn't just a mere fact that there's something there. Existence is the actuality of every aspect of what is there. In other words, be careful not to think of existence like some abstract concept that, you as Kant says, you put together a man that's 6 feet tall, 200 pounds, colored green, and then you sprinkle some existence on it. It's not like a little final added quality. Existence is the principle by which every aspect of that being is rendered real. It is the reality of every aspect of the being. So when you ask the question, could a thing's nature be identical to existence, you're asking, is the fundamental form or structure of that being such that it could be responsible for everything that pertains to existence? Because if it were, then there could be no quality of existence removed from it. If you remove a quality of existence, then you've got a finite being, and you've got a being whose nature isn't identical to existence. Very important to realize these are not just words. We're talking about realities, trying to understand two aspects to them. One, that they have a certain set of qualities, but two, that those qualities are all present by reason of a real activity, which we use the word existence to describe. What it is, it says there, the fundamental actuality. We don't have a more basic word for existence. What are you going to put it in terms of? Something non-existent? Frogginess? Well, we don't have another word for it. As I say, I'm not trying here to demonstrate the existence of this being, which would be, as you probably already realize, what we call God. This argument doesn't do that. What it does, though, is to show that a universe of finite beings is a universe whose nature, each individual thing's nature, can't be identical with a fullness of existence. It can't be identical with existence. It can be responsible for certain properties of existence, but not existence as such. And I told you at the beginning of our discussion, this is going to be a little bit more in-depth than some of the things that we've gone through before. I'm not going to try to go further with this. Does anybody have a question or something they want to have clarified before I give up for the evening? All right.
I was just going to make a comment. This is on what you said earlier about the difference between the sciences, and that is in the modern world, the opposite. It's looked upon in the opposite manner. That it is the hard sciences where we get certitude, and it's philosophy that is a lot of just dreaming notions that can't be verified or nobody can know for sure.
Right. And that's why it's important to always bring this back down to the concretely existing things that we find in the world around us. Everything in this room is vibrantly real. But what it means to be a finite being is it means you're just what you are. This table is just what it is at this moment. With the properties it's got, no more. It only expresses that much reality of the world, but the world is boundless reality. Reality can be manifested unlimited ways, but no limited being expresses it in unlimited ways. It does it in a limited way by reason of its nature. So the nature can't be identical to this actuality that pervades all things that have it in limited proportions. So that's obviously the starting point for the argument which will eventually lead you to an infinite being, but through other logical steps that we do not have time to go into tonight.
This recording is produced and distributed by Old Team Library Services, all rights reserved. For more, go to www.aquinasphilosophy.com.